Hello,
Hi.
Professor.
Is that functioning, this technology, all right?
It's completely functional now.
Yeah.
Lovely morning. Good morning, Professor.
Yeah.
Finally.
Well done. Yeah, absolutely.
How are you, Professor?
I'm fine. Are you all right? Where
Uh,
are you
um,
exactly?
I'm actually now in Baghdad. Professor David, it's a great and pleasure. It's actually honor to meet you and to talk to you now in this lovely short interview. So hopefully you have your lovely coffee, and if not, I can send you over one from Baghdad.
One day that will be possible, won't it? With 3D,
Inshallah, fingers crossed. How are
3D
you,
printing.
Professor?
Yeah, I'm fine. Thank you. Yes.
Great.
Sounds fine to me. Yeah.
Great. Please allow me to tell you a little bit about myself. My name is Waleed. I'm an education consultant. I have a PhD in linguistics from Babylon University, and I host such awesome and great people like you. So actually, it's my pleasure to see you, and it's an honor to all Iraq to meet such a great person, a well-published author of many lovely textbooks
Oh,
that are
gosh.
taught here in Baghdad and all Iraq. So this is the first one that got me in the entrapment of English.
Oh, wow. Well, gosh.
Um,
Yes.
so let's get started with the first question of our interview, and that is why English is a global language, Professor. You have all the floor.
Oh, right. Thank you very much. Well, it's a delight to have the opportunity to chat to you about this sort of topic. I mean, it is probably one of the biggest topics of all, given that English has become so global.
Yes.
In the latest statistics I did for the English language encyclopedia, the third edition, a couple of years ago, it's something like 2.3 billion people around the world using English, which is, again, a significant increase on what the previous figures. So it is becoming increasingly global. And so the question indeed is, why? And there is one very simple answer to this question. A language becomes international and then global for one reason only, and that is the power of the people who speak it.
Okay.
That sounds like a very simple answer, but of course, when one explores the question, what is power? Then, of course, it means many different things. And so you break down the question next into the different types of power that made English a global language. And in my view, there are four main types. There's first of all the obvious one, the one that everybody knows about, the political, military power, if you will, of the British Empire. So we're talking now about a period of expansion of English into, first of all, the British Isles, generally Ireland, and then into what is now the United States, and then eventually throughout the empire world. Yeah, the second kind of power is less well known, and that is scientific and technological power. We're talking now about the period of the Industrial Revolution in Europe, which is the 17th and 18th centuries. And when you actually look at all the inventions that were made at that time, locomotives and textile spinning and new types of roads and all of this, then it turns out that the majority of the people who did the inventing were speakers of English. And as a result, English became the language of science and technology, and still is, of course, very largely. So that's the second kind of power. And then the third kind of power is in the 19th century, when you get economic power driving a language. They say money talks. Well, what language was it talking? Well, at the beginning of the 19th century, it was Britain and the new United States that were the driving forces of economic power in the world. Germany too, of course, with the development of money and banking and things like that. But predominantly English during the 19th century. And after the First World War, of course, Germany goes out of the equation and we're left with English as a dominant force. Or, people talk pounds and dollars more than anything else. And then the fourth kind of power is cultural power. The 20th century here now. We travel around the world, as I'm sure you do, Walid, and what happens is you go in a cab anywhere, and on the radio there is English,
Yeah.
And so we're now talking about the language of broadcasting, of popular music, of international travel, of the internet, and all of these things. And the vast majority of cultural developments in the 20th century either began in an English-speaking country or were immediately facilitated by an English-speaking country. Now, that last point is important. I'm talking about, for example, cinema, film, which did not begin in an English-speaking country. It began in France, but within 20 years, where was it? In Hollywood. And so once again, English language becomes the dominant voice of cinema. So these are the four reasons why English became a global language, in short.
Professor, let me digress here with you on this point, because it's very significant when it comes to analyzing the structure of English. And I know that you are more interested in the identities of other speakers of languages who speak English. I've heard you say that in one of the lovely interviews that you had with a nice gentleman, I think from Australia. You said that I love to hear, and this is to quote you, I love to hear English with a Spanish accent. So my question is, do you like to hear English with only Spanish or French or Arabic accent, or you prefer to hear it with an English accent? And why is the international identities important to you as the language is exploding and being used everywhere?
Accents have always been part of language from the very beginning for all languages, and English no exception. When English began in Anglo-Saxon times in the 6th and 7th centuries, we know that there were different accents because the way the scribes wrote English down, they spelt the words differently depending upon the accent that they had. So accents have always been here within English. And so it's no surprise at all that when English spreads as a global language, the same forces will apply. And the forces are, as you rightly say, identity as well as intelligibility. These are the two big forces that drive a language. Intelligibility, we have to understand each other. But identity, we have to say who we are and where we're from and which community we belong to, and also which community we do not belong to. The two main forces that drive language, intelligibility and identity. We need to understand each other, but we also need to show other people who we are and where we're from and which community we belong to. And accent is the main way of expressing identity because it's easy to perceive. You can perceive it in the dark and around corners, and it's not like any other way of showing your identity. So as a result, when English spreads around the world, the thing I would expect to happen is that the different Englishes in the world will manifest themselves partly by vocabulary, partly by grammar, but mainly through pronunciation. And this delights me. It's not just Spanish or whatever, it's any variety of anybody who chooses to use English, who says, I want to learn English now. Then immediately they have a right in it. It is theirs. They have ownership over it. And they should take pride in the fact that they have chosen to use English from their part of the world. Now, as long as, of course, they maintain intelligibility. It'd be no good if you had a very local accent in some country somewhere and nobody could understand you. No, not talking about that. I'm talking about somebody who has developed a fluency in English, like your good self, and you have an accent that identifies you from where you are from, and this is as it should be. Why would you want to talk exactly like me? You are not me. You are not British, and I don't want you to hide identity in this sort of way. So my recommendation is, you see, that people should be proud of their accent. I like to use the analogy of going into a garden and you see all the flowers in a garden. If they're all the same, it's so boring. If they're all different, then this is a very interesting garden. It's the same with language. The accents are like a garden of flowers around the English-speaking world. And the more variation there is, the more diversity there is, the more interesting the language becomes.
Professor, talking about this kind of analogy is really important to shed some light and highlight the point that some of the textbooks that have been published recently are some sort of marketed as a learn English with an American accent or British accent or Australian accent or something like that. So what's your point? What's your stand regarding these kind of textbooks that have been published and marketed with a specific accent? Do you think that they are necessarily important to be taught, or do you think that these have been taking English from a very different corner of interpretation of how language should be taught and learned?
That's a very interesting question. There are really just two main varieties of English in the world when it comes to accent, as you say, British English and American English. Australian, not so much. South African, not so much. So the two main ones, British and American. Now, if you're going to learn English, you will learn it from a teacher or from a course, which comes from one or other of those two constituencies. So you will end up learning a British kind of English or an American kind of English, inevitably. So if you do the first way, you will end up saying schedule. If you do the second way, you'll end up saying schedule, and so on. Now, the point is that you can't avoid this. So if a textbook is going to be written which teaches you English, it must use one or other of those two main models. But having said that, it still allows for the point about accent that we were talking about a few seconds ago. If I learn a British English, schedule, I can say it in a Welsh way, schedule. I can say it in a Scottish way, schedule, and so on. I have many accents of British English that I can use to say the word schedule. And so have you. So if you're Spanish or French or whatever, you will say the word schedule with a slight tinge of your local accent. Now, if you learn schedule, the same thing will apply, you see. You'll use an American schedule, but you'll overlay it with some level of locality that reflects your identity.
I've met a lot of teachers who don't look at language from a horizontal point of view where every accent is equal to another in terms of like the transparency and the beauty of it. They look at some accents or some varieties of accents from a hierarchical point of view where this one is better than the other one. So what's your advice to teachers when it comes to teaching language? We understand that the language has a wide gamut, a wide spectrum of varieties and a wide aspects and points and foci that need to be focused on. So what are the, probably if we can corner this conversation to certain feasible and tangible elements, based on your lovely experience, you have spectacular amount of experience when it comes to language learning and publications in this field. What are your 5 tips or 6 tips for the English teacher when it comes to teaching language?
Well, I don't know whether I can get to 5 or 6, but I certainly would want the first one to be a recognition of what all teachers know, the distinction between production and comprehension. If you are choosing to teach English, you're not alone. You're doing so in a context. The context is one of your own background in English, how you were taught, the materials that you have available, and very important, the examination system that your students are going to move towards. Now, all these organizations and the broader context beyond that this will give you an indication as to what kind of accent is going to go down well, as it were. Yes, all accents are equal linguistically, but some sociolinguistically are more equal than others. And this is because of the prestige and the tradition. It's the same in Britain. You know, all accents are equal, but there are some accents that the institutions like the BBC and the Queen and so on are going to use, and these will carry greater prestige. Now, it's important that whatever accent you choose to use, you use it with pride and develop a competence in it, but not at the expense of denigrating other accents. That's the distinction. If you're used to teaching British English, received pronunciation, for instance, that's how you were brought up, that's what the materials are, that's what the exam boards want, then fine, carry on as a production mechanism. But when it comes to listening comprehension, it would be very bad news if the only accent that the students heard in class was received pronunciation. Because if they go out into the big wide world, they will not hear received pronunciation very often. It's only spoken by 2% of the population of England. If you stand on the corner of a London street, you will hear 1,000 accents in the course of the day.
Oh my God.
only a couple of those are going to be received pronunciation. So it's very important that in terms of listening comprehension, from the very beginning, in my view, teachers expose students to as wide a range of accents as possible. And this is now very easy because of, thanks to the internet. You can find almost every English accent available. Do you know? Do you know IDEA? IDEA, the International Dialects of English Archive, based in America. But the gentleman who runs that, Paul Mayer, he has his intention is to collect examples of all English accents, and he's got several hundred already. So it's really easy now for people to get exposure to a wide range of accents. They can still carry on learning in production the accent that they find most familiar.
It's really fascinating how we can access to hundreds of accents from around the world. There's a website on the internet called Googlish where you can access to certain phrase spoken in American or British or Australian or Canadian accent. It's quite fascinating. Professor, there are so many novice teachers like me. I consider myself as a novice teacher in this beautiful field. Self-development is a necessity to professional development of teachers, and they have to do that sustainably, consistently, and in a perseverant way. What are your tips? You have a wealth of experience in this field. What are your tips for teachers to maintain some self-development in their career?
Well, I would say, first of all, keep an eye on other development, that is the development of their students. We all have to remember that we see our students for an hour or so every day or a couple of days, and the rest of the time they are out there, often listening to English on the internet and in all the other domains where English is used. And so they have interests, they have hobbies, they have preferences. I think it's very important that the English we teach in class recognizes that and builds on it, rather than just the English that is in the textbook, which is, let's go and visit the zoo, or let's go and shop in Oxford Street, or something like that, which is fine, but what about the interests of the students? And so the first tip I would say would be to do a little kind of case analysis, or ask the class, what are their interests? What are the things they want to talk about in English? Not what are the things I'm going to teach you in English. What would you like to talk about? And I think that's a very important step that often isn't done. That would be what I would do first.
Do I understand that you are an advocate of student-centered language learning and teaching?
Well, I'm not an advocate of anything, because remember, I'm not a teacher. I'm a linguist. I don't do the difficult job of going into a classroom and have to teach this stuff. I just analyze it and talk about it as I've been doing. So I don't advocate any one particular approach, but I have been in a lot of classrooms. And what I notice that a sort of balance between the two is the ideal that one works towards. It's not a question of student-orientated versus teacher-orientated. It's a matter of achieving some sort of balance between the two. And those are the classrooms that I find seem to be working most successfully.
Professor, thank you so much for these insightful comments. Actually, you have a wealth of experience in this field. Final comments about the globality of English and whether you think it's a short term or does it have any expired date where it's going to be dominated by another language, or it should deserve more attention by government institutions to be taught, especially here in Middle East. It's widely common to find institutions that teach English as the second language, but it gets indoctrinated in a very grammar-based approach. This is probably, and hopefully we can tackle in another meeting if we can secure, because I know that you have very limited time in your day and you have tsunami of calls. So the question is, again, do you think English is going to be still dominant in the world, or it's going to be controlled or dominated by another language, and why?
Well, all the evidence at the moment suggests that English is going to stay the way it is for the foreseeable future. And by that, I mean for the next century at least.
Okay.
The statistics seem to bear this out. Do you remember I mentioned a few minutes ago that there were 2.3 billion speakers in the world? Well, that is an increase in the last 15 years of something like 300 million or something of that sort. That is not as rapid an increase as English had earlier, but it is still an increase. And all the suggestion is that this increase is going to continue. You go to the parts of the world where there are, shall we say, competitors for English. You go to China, for instance, and what you see there is still an increased number of people learning English. It's always difficult to predict the future. I wouldn't dare do that. I mean, 1,000 years ago, Latin was the dominant language of Europe. And if you had said 1,000 years ago, one day there will be no Latin, apart from in a few cases, people would have thought you were mad. So in 1,000 years' time, will English still be the dominant language? I have no idea. Maybe they will land from some other planet, and by then, and we will all be speaking an alien language. Who can say? No, there are other dominant languages in the world. Remember what I said at the very beginning?
Yes.
A language becomes a dominant language because of the power of the people who speak it. So your question is really, you're asking me to predict the power politics of the planet, and that is an impossible thing. It could indeed in hundreds of years be Chinese, it could be Arabic, it could be Spanish, it could be anything. But at the moment, it seems to be English, and it's likely to stay that way for at least the foreseeable future.
Professor David Crystal, thank you so much for this lovely meeting. I hope I can secure another meeting with you in the foreseeable future, in the near future. I know how busy you are. Thank you so much for giving me the honor to meet you in person, to have this lovely interview from Baghdad. As far as I know, I'm probably the first Iraqi person who interviews you via Zoom, or have there been any other person?
No, I think you're right. I've managed to do the occasional talk to Iraq over the years, but not very often. And indeed, it's a delight to have this opportunity. So thank you for your interest, Walid, and good luck for the next podcast.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Professor. Your books are taught everywhere in this country. You might not have been told, but English, all varieties of books by Professor David Crystal are taught here in this country, including how English works, and also the lovely, beautiful, best encyclopedia about English language by David Crystal. Professor, thank you so much for being in this host interview. Thank you so much, and I look forward to see you in the future, hopefully.
Well, thank you once again. And as we say when we're signing off these days in our COVID days, stay safe. Stay safe.
Thank you. Likewise, Professor. Have a lovely and beautiful day.
Bye-bye now.
Bye-bye.